The air smelled of grease and stale coffee. A flickering neon sign buzzed above the small-town diner, its hum blending with a faint rumble of trucks passing on the wet road outside. Rainwater dripped from the awning, pattering onto cracked asphalt. Inside, the fluorescent lights cast everything in a tired, yellow glow. Plates clattered in the kitchen. A lone radio whispered old songs that no one was really listening to. And in the corner booth, half hidden beneath the shadow of his cap, sat a man. He looked rough around the edges. His polo shirt was faded, and his jeans were worn thin at the knees. To the world, he appeared like another drifter, maybe homeless, maybe just down on his luck. He stirred the black coffee in front of him, untouched, his eyes darting not to the drink, but to the people around him. What no one knew, not the tired waitress, not the grumbling cook, not the young man sweeping the floor, was that this stranger wasn't who he seemed. George, age 35, wasn't a drifter at all. He was the CEO of the company that owned this very chain of diners. And he was here for a reason. He wanted to see the truth. The story began a few weeks earlier, when anonymous letters started arriving at George's office. Letters from employees, handwritten, desperate, some even unsigned. We're treated like we don't matter. They cut our hours if we speak up. Management pockets tips. George could have dismissed them. Many CEOs did. But something gnawed at him. He remembered his own childhood, how his mother had scrubbed tables and washed dishes for pennies just to put food on their table. He knew what it meant to be unseen. So George made a choice. He would walk into his own business as no one, see what his workers saw, live what they lived. And so here he sat, blending into the noise of the diner, waiting to begin. The first shift he observed started quietly. The waitress, Ava, moved with a limp in her step, though she never let it stop her from greeting each customer with a tired smile. She couldn't have been older than 40, but her face looked worn with years of worry. Every time she passed by George's booth, she refilled his coffee without asking, even though he never touched it. Behind the counter, a young dishwasher named Samuel rushed between sinks, his hands raw from hot water. He looked barely 20, but the deep circles under his eyes betrayed long nights and little sleep. And then there was Rick, the manager, a tall, broad man with slick-back hair, a booming voice, and a presence that filled the diner. He barked orders without looking at the people he gave them to. Plates slammed, voices low when he walked by. It didn't take long for George to notice the first injustice. Ava slid a bill across to a customer, who left a $10 bill on the table. She scooped it up quickly, tucked it into her apron pocket, only for Rick to stride over. "I'll take that," he said, snatching it from her hands. "That was my table," Ava whispered. "Company policy." "You know the deal," Rick sneered, stuffing the money into his own pocket before marching back toward the office. Ava stood frozen for a moment, then forced a smile when the next customer walked in. George saw the way her eyes glistened, the way she swallowed her pride. George clenched his jaw. Company policy? He knew very well that it was a lie. Tips belonged to servers. Always had, always would. The night stretched on. Samuel's arm brushed against a scalding pot as he hurried past the line. He winced, nearly dropped it. Rick saw, but instead of checking if he was okay, the manager barked. "Watch it, kid. Break one more plate, and you'll be paying for it out of your check." Samuel muttered an apology, clutching his arm. He didn't stop working. George watched, his heart heavy. These weren't just employees. They were people with stories, with lives weighed down by circumstances they couldn't control. And yet, here they were, still showing up and still giving everything. Later that night, George struck up a conversation with Ava when the diner was nearly empty. "You've been on your feet all day," he said softly. She smiled faintly, though her exhaustion showed. "Yeah, well, that's life, right? Don't you get a break?" Ava laughed bitterly. "Breaks? Haven't had one in years." She lowered her voice. "But it's fine. I've got 2 kids at home. Rent doesn't wait." Something in her tone cut deep. It was resilience, but also resignation. George wanted to tell her who he was right then. He wanted to promise her that things would change. But he stayed silent, nodding, blending in. He needed to see more. The second day revealed even darker truths. George arrived early, before the rain had dried on the streets. From the alley behind the diner, he caught sight of Rick handing an envelope to a delivery man. It was thick, cash bulging at the sides. "Keep quiet, and the rest will come next week," Rick muttered. George's stomach twisted. Was the manager skimming money? Running side deals? He made a mental note. Inside, Samuel coughed violently while scrubbing trays. Rick walked past, waving the smell away. "Don't hack all over the dishes. Kid, customers don't want your germs." "I'm fine," Samuel whispered, though his pale face said otherwise. George leaned closer. "You don't sound fine." Samuel glanced around, then lowered his voice. "Can't afford to take a day off. Last time I did, they cut my hours for a month." George's chest tightened. This wasn't just about unfair pay. It was about fear, a culture of silence. By the third day, George's anger simmered. He watched as Rick berated Ava in front of customers for being too slow, though she was juggling 6 tables by herself. He saw Samuel forced to stay late without extra pay. But then, something unexpected happened. A little girl ran into the diner, clutching a crumpled drawing. She jumped into Ava's arms. "Mama, look what I made at school." Ava's face lit up just for that moment. Pure joy. She kissed her daughter's forehead before hurriedly sending her back outside with an older sibling. George sat there, stunned. Here was a woman carrying the weight of the world, yet still finding the strength to smile for her child. That was the moment George knew he couldn't stay silent much longer. The breaking point came one late night. A trucker, drunk and loud, shoved his plate away. "This food's garbage," he barked at Ava. She apologized, offered to replace it, but the man slammed his fist on the counter. "You think you're worth my money?" Before Ava could speak, Rick stormed out, not to defend her, but to side with the customer. "Sir, you're absolutely right," Rick said smoothly. "Your meal's on the house." "And Ava," he turned to her, voice sharp, "you're lucky I don't fire you on the spot." Tears welled in Ava's eyes. She whispered, "I did nothing wrong." George stood then. For the first time in days, he rose to his full height, pulled the cap from his head, and let his voice cut through the diner. "Enough." The room fell silent. Everyone turned to look at him. His presence shifted. No longer just another drifter, but something heavier, commanding. Rick sneered. "And who the hell are you supposed to be?" George's jaw tightened. He stepped forward. "I'm the one who built this company from the ground up," he said slowly, his eyes locked on Rick's. "And I've been watching you." Gasps echoed through the diner. Ava's hand flew to her mouth. Samuel nearly dropped the tray he was holding. The truth was out. But the story doesn't end there. Because the moment George revealed himself, the real battle began. Would justice finally be served? Would the workers find freedom? Or would Rick fight back with the power he thought he had? The answers would come, but not tonight. And so, under the harsh yellow lights of that small-town diner, the mask had fallen. A CEO disguised as a nobody had finally shown his face. But with his identity revealed, George wasn't just a witness anymore. He was a threat. And those who had been exploiting his people, they weren't about to let go without a fight. Too often, the people who hold everything together go unseen. The waitress who hides her pain behind a smile. The young worker who sacrifices his health for a paycheck. The single mother who gives everything she has, yet receives so little in return. George's story reminds us of something essential. True leadership begins with empathy. It means seeing the invisible, standing with the overlooked, and having the courage to confront injustice, no matter how small, no matter how hidden. Because at the end of the day, the strength of a company, a community, even a family, is never built on profit alone. It's built on people. And when we choose to treat people with dignity, respect, and compassion, we don't just change their lives, we change the world. The diner felt frozen in time. Forks hung midday. Conversation stopped mid-sentence. Even the radio in the corner seemed to hush itself. George stood tall now, his cap no longer hiding him, his voice no longer timid. 4 days, he had been a shadow, watching, listening, collecting truths. But tonight, the shadow had stepped into the light. "I'm the one who built this company from the ground up," he repeated, his words low, deliberate. "And I've been watching you." Rick's smirk faltered, but only for a moment. He straightened, puffing out his chest, trying to reassert control. Don't play games. You expect me to believe some drifter is a big boss? You've been sitting here sipping free coffee for 3 days. George stepped closer, his eyes locked on Rick's. Yes, because I wanted to see for myself what's been happening inside these walls. And what I've seen. He paused, scanning the room. His gaze landed on Ava, still trembling near the counter. On Samuel, pale and exhausted, clutching a tray. On the cook, who had gone completely silent in the kitchen doorway. What I've seen is shameful. Rick scoffed. Oh, please. You think anybody cares? These people, he gestured toward Ava and Samuel. They're replaceable. You fire one, 10 more will line up at the door. That's how this business works. The words cut through the air like a knife. Ava flinched. Samuel's head dropped. George's jaw tightened. No, that's how you've chosen to run it. That's not how it was meant to be. He turned slightly, addressing the staff. I started this company with a promise that we'd be more than just another place people clock in and out of, that we'd treat every worker with dignity, that no one would ever feel invisible. A hush fell. Ava's lips parted, her eyes wide, as if daring to believe it might be true. Rick barked out a laugh, though it sounded more nervous and confident. Big speeches don't pay bills. Buddy, you think these people care who you are? They need hours. They need money. And as long as I'm running this place, they'll do what I say. George's voice sharpened. Not anymore. He pulled a phone from his pocket. The screen lit up with a company logo. A few taps, and he placed a call. His words were calm, but final. This is George Reynolds. Effective immediately, Rick Lawson is suspended from all management duties. Send HR down here now. Rick's face drained of color. Wait, what? George pocketed the phone and faced him squarely. You've been stealing tips, threatening workers, and running side deals behind my back. I've seen it. Everyone here has seen it. Your time is over. For the first time, Rick didn't have a comeback. He stood frozen, sweating, his bravado crumbling in front of everyone. The silence was broken by Ava. Her voice was quiet, shaky, but steady enough to carry. Sir, you really are? George turned to her, his expression softening. Yes, Ava, I am. Her eyes welled. I didn't think anyone cared. I thought we were just forgotten. George's chest tightened. He reached out, placing a reassuring hand on her shoulder. Not forgotten. Never forgotten. You and Samuel and everyone here, you're the reason this company even exists. Without you, there's no diner, no business, nothing. A tear slipped down her cheek. She quickly brushed it away, but George saw it, and he knew it wasn't just relief. It was years of struggle, finally breaking through the surface. Moments later, 2 corporate HR representatives walked into the diner. Their suits looked out of place under the flickering fluorescent lights. George briefed them quickly. Rick protested, but his words fell flat. There were too many witnesses now. Too much truth laid bare. Mr. Lawson, one of the HR officers, said firmly, "Please gather your belongings. You'll be escorted out." Rick's eyes darted around, desperate. He looked at Ava, at Samuel, at George. Finally, his shoulders slumped. The fight was gone. With a muttered curse, he stormed toward the office, slamming the door behind him. The tension in the diner eased, just slightly. The workers exchanged glances, hesitant, unsure if the sudden shift was real. George turned back to them. I know you've been hurt, lied to, taken advantage of. That ends tonight. Things will change. And I promise you, I'll make it right. Over the next hour, George sat with his employees, listening, not as a CEO, but as a man. Ava told him about the night she came home, so exhausted she barely had energy to help her kids with homework. Samuel confessed he was working 2 jobs just to cover rent, often sleeping only a few hours a night. Others shared their stories too. Missed birthdays, skipped meals, broken dreams, all sacrificed to keep this diner alive. George listened to every word, his heart heavy, his resolve hardening. "This is not the company I built," he said finally, "but together we're going to rebuild it." The very next day, changes began. Workers were given proper breaks. Overtime pay was reinstated. Tips were returned to servers. Schedules were restructured to allow for family time. George even arranged healthcare support for staff who had gone without it for years. And for Ava, he made sure she had flexible shifts so she could be home with her kids when they needed her most. When she tried to thank him, George shook his head. "Don't thank me. Thank yourself. For surviving this long. For never giving up." Ava smiled, though her eyes still glistened. "Maybe now," she whispered, "my kid will finally see me smile for real." But the fallout didn't end with Rick's firing. Investigations revealed he had been siphoning money from multiple locations, pocketing thousands over the years. He had built a network of silence, using fear to keep people quiet. Now, with George's testimony and the courage of workers finally willing to speak, Rick faced not only termination but potential legal consequences. Justice was catching up. Weeks later, George returned to the diner, not undercover, not hidden, but openly as himself. The place looked different, brighter. The staff moved with lighter steps. The atmosphere wasn't heavy anymore. It was hopeful. Samuel greeted him at the door, smiling for the first time. "Sir, George, I got some sleep last night. A full 8 hours." George chuckled warmly. "That's worth more than gold." And Ava, she walked over with her daughter, who shyly handed George another drawing. This one wasn't crumpled. It was neat, colorful, and full of life. "Thank you," Ava said quietly. George crouched to the little girl's level, taking the picture gently. "No, thank you. Your mom is the strongest person I've ever met. Don't ever forget that." The little girl beamed. Ava's hand trembled as she squeezed George's in gratitude. That night, George sat alone in the same corner booth where it had all begun. The neon sign still flickered. The radio still played. The smell of coffee and grease still hung in the air. But something had changed. Not just in the diner. Not just in the workers. In him. He had come looking for the truth about his business. What he found was bigger than that. He found the truth about leadership, about humanity, about the quiet resilience of people who give everything and ask for nothing in return. George's story is more than a corporate tale. It's a reminder that leadership is not about power, it's about responsibility. That empathy is not weakness, it's strength. And that sometimes the greatest truths are not found in boardrooms or balance sheets, but in the tired smiles of workers, in the whispered stories of single mothers, in the raw hands of dishwashers. When we strip away titles, uniforms, and appearances, we are left with something simple, something undeniable. People. And people matter. Always. The sun dipped low over the city skyline, casting a golden glow on the glass towers that gleamed like giants. From his office window, George watched the streets below. Cars honked, people hurried, the city pulsed with life. But George's mind wasn't on the skyline. It was on the letters piled on his desk. More complaints, more cries for help, from different locations, different managers, different workers. The diner where Ava and Samuel work had been only one piece of the puzzle. One rotten branch on a tree that had grown twisted over the years. George rubbed his temples. How many more were suffering in silence? How deep did the rut go? He knew one thing. He couldn't stop now. If he dared to go undercover once, he could do it again. And again. And again. This wasn't just about one diner anymore. This was about the entire company. The first diner he visited after Ava's was in the industrial part of the city, an area where smokestacks painted the sky gray and the streets never really slept. The diner itself looked busy, humming with late-night truckers and factory workers. The neon sign buzzed with energy. But the moment George stepped inside, his heart sank. The smell of burnt oil hit him first. The tables were sticky, the staff moved like ghosts, their eyes dull, their movements mechanical. The air was heavy, not with sound, but with silence. The kind of silence born from fear. George kept his disguise simple. Cap, jeans, worn jacket. Just another man blending into the night. He slid into a booth, ordered coffee, and watched. The injustices revealed themselves quickly. A young immigrant cook, barely speaking English, was shouted at for being too slow, even though he was juggling orders single-handedly. His manager, a sharp-faced woman with a voice like a whip, mocked him openly. A teenage hostess wiped a tear from her eyes when a customer harassed her. Instead of protection, the manager hissed, "Smile more. Don't make a scene. Do you want to lose this job?" George's blood boiled. He clenched his cup so tightly his knuckles turned white. The cruelty here wasn't hidden. It was open, normalized, and the workers endured it because they had no choice. One night, George caught the cook, whose name was Lewis, sitting outside on the curb, head in his hands. "You okay?" George asked gently. Lewis shook his head, struggling for words in English. "I send money home. Family in Mexico. I stay quiet. Need a job. No choice." George's chest ached. This man wasn't just cooking food. He was carrying the weight of an entire family across borders. And yet he was treated as if he were disposable. George placed a hand on his shoulder. "You're not invisible, Lewis. Not to me." Lewis looked at him, confused, but there was a spark of hope in his tired eyes. The deeper George dug, the clearer the picture became. The problem wasn't just Rick. It wasn't just one bad manager. It was systemic. Managers across multiple diners had created their own kingdoms of fear, skimming money, silencing complaints, exploiting workers. And because George had spent years in the corporate tower, far from the front lines, he had never seen it. Now, seeing it with his own eyes, he couldn't unsee it. But with every discovery came new resistance. Word began to spread. Other managers started whispering, "The boss is snooping around, is going undercover, watching us." Some doubled down on their cruelty, determined to prove they were untouchable. Others grew nervous, hiding evidence, cleaning up just enough to avoid suspicion. And at headquarters, George's board of directors began to push back. "George," one executive warned, slamming a folder onto the table. "What you're doing is reckless. Going undercover like some vigilante. It's beneath you." "Beneath me?" George shot back. "You mean caring about the people who make this company possible? They are workers. They come and go. But your job, our job, is to protect profits. And right now, your little crusade is costing us money." George's hands curled into fists. "If protecting profits means turning a blind eye to abuse, then maybe I'm in the wrong company." The room fell silent. The executives exchanged uneasy glances. They weren't used to a CEO who put people before profit. The battle lines were drawn. On one side, George, determined to rebuild the company from the ground up with empathy and justice. On the other hand, a corporate machine that valued numbers over lives, and corrupt managers who had built empires on fear. It wasn't just about saving diners anymore. It was about saving the soul of the company. Back at the industrial diner, George decided it was time to act. One evening, he stood quietly in the shadows, watching the sharp-faced manager berate Lewis once again. Her words were cruel, her tone venomous. Finally, George stepped forward, removing his cap just as he had done before. "Enough!" The word rang out, silencing the diner. Workers froze. The manager turned, eyes narrowing. "Who are you?" she snapped. George's voice was steady. "The man who owns this company. And the man who's here to tell you, your reign of fear is over." Gasps rippled through the room. Lewis's eyes widened. The hostess covered her mouth. The manager scoffed. "You think you scare me? You don't know how things work here. I run this place. Without me, this diner falls apart." George stepped closer, his eyes unwavering. "No, without them, this diner falls apart." He gestured to the workers. "Not you. And starting tonight, they are done being your victims." "Enough!" The word rang out, silencing the diner. Workers froze. The manager turned, eyes narrowing. "Who are you?" she snapped. George's voice was steady. "The man who owns this company. And the man who's here to tell you, your reign of fear is over." Gasps rippled through the room. Lewis's eyes widened. The hostess covered her mouth. The manager scoffed. "You think you scare me? You don't know how things work here. I run this place. Without me, this diner falls apart." George stepped closer, his eyes unwavering. No, without them, this diner falls apart. He gestured to the workers. Not you, them. And starting tonight, they are done being your victims. Within hours, HR descended again. The manager's empire crumbled. And just like with Rick, the silence was broken. Workers began to speak, to share, to hope, but every diner George visited revealed more the same. More managers exploiting, more workers suffering. And with every location he turned around, resistance grew stronger. Soon, anonymous threats began appearing in George's office. Notes slipped under his door. Emails with no sender. Stop meddling, or you will regret it. Stay out of the diners if you value your safety. It was clear, George's crusade wasn't just about workers anymore. He had enemies, powerful ones, who would do anything to protect the old system. The question wasn't whether George dared to continue. It was whether he and his workers could survive what was coming. Change is never easy, and the greater the change, the greater the resistance. George's story shows us that when you choose to stand for what's right, you won't just face applause, you will face opposition. People will try to silence you, intimidate you, break you. But progress is born not in comfort, but in conflict. And leadership isn't tested when things are easy, it's tested when the world pushes back. If we choose empathy over fear, justice over silence, and people over profit, then even the darkest system can be transformed. And sometimes, the first step to changing the world is daring to take off the disguise and tell the truth. The night was restless. George sat alone in his office, the city glittering outside like 1,000 tiny promises he wasn't sure he could keep. On his desk were stacks of reports, evidence of everything he had uncovered. Exploitation, harassment, workers silenced by fear. He had been to 5 diners now, 5 different branches of his company. And though the faces changed, the cook, the hostess, the janitor, the single mother, the story remained the same. His company, the empire he had built with pride, was rotting from the inside. And tonight, he knew, the battle was no longer just about saving workers. It was about saving the very soul of his company from those who would rather see him fail. The threats had grown louder. One morning, George arrived at work to find his office door defaced with spray paint. Step down, or else. Anonymous emails filled his inbox. Stop your crusade before someone stops you. Even the board of directors had turned colder. They spoke in hushed tones when he entered meetings, their eyes narrowing, their patience thinning. One board member finally said what the rest were thinking. George, your undercover antics have to end. You're destabilizing the company. Profits are down. The shareholders are furious. If you don't stop, we'll have no choice but to consider replacing you. The word replacing echoed in the room like a gunshot. George leaned forward, voice steady. Then replace me. Because if the price of this chair is looking the other way while good people suffer, I don't deserve to sit in it. The board members exchanged looks. They had underestimated him, but resistance only grew fiercer. At one diner in the suburbs, George went undercover yet again. This time, things were different. The staff seemed nervous, almost rehearsed. The manager forced smiles, and the workers avoided eye contact. It felt like a trap, and he was right. That night, as he walked home, 2 men in dark jackets followed him into an alley. One stepped forward. You're making a lot of noise. Boss, maybe it's time you shut up. George's pulse raced, but he didn't flinch. If you think threatening me will stop me, you don't know who you're dealing with. The men smirked, shoving him hard against the wall. But just as quickly as it began, headlights flooded the alley. Police sirens wailed. The men scattered into the night. George stood there, shaken but unbroken. Someone had tried to silence him, and that meant he was closer to the truth than ever. The turning point came not in an alley, but in a diner just outside the city. There, George met a worker who embodied everything he was fighting for. Her name was Clarissa. She was a single mother of 3, juggling 2 jobs just to keep her children fed. She worked double shifts, often without breaks, often without pay for her overtime. And yet, she smiled. She encouraged younger workers. She slipped food to the homeless when the manager wasn't watching. George saw in her the same resilience he had seen in Ava, in Louis, in Samuel. But Clarice's quiet strength struck him deeper. Late one evening, George asked her, "Why do you keep going? When they treat you this way, when you barely make enough, why keep showing up?" Clarissa looked at him, eyes tired but full of fire. "Because my kids are watching. Because if I give up, what do I teach them? That life wins? No, I teach them to fight, even if it's just by showing up." George felt a lump in his throat. This is why I can't stop, he thought. This is who I'm fighting for. The showdown came weeks later. George called an emergency town hall meeting with workers from every diner. Managers were instructed to attend. Executives too. The room buzzed with nervous energy as hundreds filled the hall. Workers whispered to one another, unsure of what was about to happen. Managers sat stiffly, arms crossed, their authority suddenly fragile. And at the front, George stood, not in his tailored suit, but in the same cap and worn jacket he had worn during his undercover nights. He looked out at a sea of faces, faces lined with exhaustion, faces bruised by years of mistreatment, but also faces burning with hope. And he began to speak. "I built this company with a dream of serving people. Not just the customers who walk through our doors, but the workers who stand behind the counters, who wash the dishes, who make this company possible. Somewhere along the way, I lost sight of that. And in that blindness, corruption grew." He paused, scanning the crowd. "I went undercover. I worked beside you. I saw your pain. I saw your strength. And I saw the cruelty of those who believed fear was leadership." Gasps echoed. Managers shifted uncomfortably. Workers leaned forward. George's voice grew louder. "Tonight, that ends. The days of silence are over. The days of exploitation are over. From this day forward, this company belongs to its people again." The hall erupted. Workers cheered. Some cried. Managers turned pale. But not everyone clapped. From the back of the hall, a board member rose, face red with fury. "This is madness," he shouted. "You're destroying us. Do you have any idea how much money this will cost? We can't run a business on sentiment." George met his gaze. "You can't run a business without people. And if you think numbers matter more than lives, then maybe you don't belong here." The room fell silent, and in that silence, something extraordinary happened. Workers began to chant, slowly at first, then louder, until the hall shook with their voices. "People before profit. People before profit." The board members sat down, defeated. George had won, not just the argument, but the hearts of the very people who kept his company alive. In the weeks that followed, change finally took root. Exploitative managers were fired. Worker protection policies were rewritten. Overtime was paid fairly. A hotline was created so employees could report abuse without fear. Clarissa was promoted to a leadership role. Lewis was given language support and a raise. Samuel's medical bills were covered by the company. Ava was invited to headquarters, and her ideas about fair scheduling were adopted company-wide. For the first time in years, the company wasn't just surviving. It was healing. And George, he knew the battle wasn't over. There would always be resistance, always those who valued greed over empathy. But now, he also knew something else. The greatest power a leader has is not authority. It is humility. The humility to listen, to learn, to walk in the shoes of those you lead, and the courage to fight for them, even when the world tells you not to. Leadership isn't about titles. It isn't about profit margins. It isn't about sitting at the top of a tower and barking orders. True leadership is about people. It's about seeing the unseen, hearing the unheard, and standing up when it would be easier to sit down. George's story reminds us that empathy is not weakness, it is strength. Humility is not defeat, it is power. And resilience is not just survival, it is victory. So the next time you're tempted to judge someone by the role they play, the clothes they wear, or the struggles they carry in silence, remember, you never know the battles they fight when no one is watching. Because sometimes the greatest leaders are the ones willing to go undercover. Which part of George's journey hit you the hardest, and why? Was it the workers' struggles, the confrontation with corrupt managers, or the final moment of justice?